Hi, Olga, and welcome to our interview here. Could you start? Well, let's start off by could you give us our name, please?
Good day, David. My name is Wagadesk Dana Gorup Paul, and Wagadesk is my first name, Wagadesk, and that is a Micmac word from Nova Scotia. And the Micmac Nation was in effect prior to the European colonization of North America. And that's a Micmac word that means North Star. So I'm really blessed to have that name.
Well,
And yeah, the last name Paul was given to my family by the missionaries that came over, well over 500 years ago when Europe and North America were still interacting, on in a benevolent way with each other. So yeah, the missionaries thought that my family was deserving of the name Paul.
okay, great,
Yeah.
thank you. So, I can I call you Olga?
Please, yeah, Wega.
Yeah. Okay, Olga, how did you get into your sports career?
So I started diving, platform and springboard high diving because I was really good at doing flips on the trampoline. My mother had gotten us a trampoline, me, my brother, and my sister. She got us a trampoline, and it was in our backyard. And I just naturally took to doing flips very well. And so, because of that, she enrolled me in a few recreational lessons, and I had a really good ability to travel up and down
Hmm.
off the diving board instead of long and far. And the coaches noticed that and invited me onto the team. And when they did so, I was like, well, am I going to have to wear a Speedo? And they're like, yeah, you're going to have to do that if you want to compete. And I'm like, forget it then. I don't want to do it. And they're like, well, you just give it a try. Maybe you'll really like it. So, yeah, within maybe a couple months, I had a full competition list. And within the year, I was placing on the podium at provincials. And within a few years, I was national champion at the age group level.
Great. So, um, what kind of what kind of? I mean, there are various kinds of diving on various heights of the boards. I know that I tried the 10-meter once, and I know it was a long way down because I had time to think on the way down. When am I going to hit
Absolutely.
the water?
Yeah.
So, what was the level of your the board there?
So when we start off in diving,
Hmm.
we start at the lowest level, and oftentimes we'll even start at the edge of the pool, learning how to just fall. And then the next level up that we start at competitions is the 1 meter, and then the next springboard, which is the one that bends, is the 3 meter. And then there's the 5 meter, which is the first platform, and then the 7.5 meter, which is up from that, and then the 10 meter, which is up from that. But at the senior level or the open level, everybody that's above 18 competes only 10 meter in the platform event. There is no 7 meter or 5 meter for competitions in the open events.
Okay, I didn't know
Yeah,
that. That's
that's
great.
right. And so my specialty was the 10 meter platform.
Okay, so
But
how did you? When did you start doing? What age did you start doing the 10-meter?
We started doing it quite young. I think I was around maybe 14 or 15. A friend just a couple days ago posted a video of me and a friend doing a tandem forward 3.5 somersault off of the 10 meter. And that was, I think we were about 15 years old at that point.
Hmm.
And so
Wow.
yeah, I mean when we traveled to China on a training camp, there was kids that probably weren't even 10 years old who were diving off of the 10 meter. And in fact, they were so young they didn't even know how to swim yet. And
Oh,
they would do a dive, and there would be a chain of them, one holding onto the edge and one holding onto that diver, another, and then they would dive in and they would switch places. They would grab that kid, and the next kid would get up and go and do the dive. So, I
wow.
mean, yeah, in other countries they're starting far younger than us to basically come up with that, that expert technique.
So, other countries like what? America, China?
China, they're definitely pushing their athletes very hard,
Hmm.
and I mean, any country where the basic standard of living is quite low,
Hmm.
athletes kind of have more incentive to become superstars in that sport, because it just takes them out of such poverty. When here in Canada, the general population has a very good and easy life. And so, it's like, well, do I want to go dive off of this cliff 33 feet high in the air and risk my scalp every time I go by it? Or do I just want to relax and play video games?
Right.
And those kids in China and, like Russia, Cuba, like a lot of those places. And I mean, they have beautiful, beautiful lives. But the incentive to travel the world is just so much greater.
So have you ever been injured?
Yes. Out of my 10-year career, I was injured several times. And the mentality that my coach had was to simply persevere through it. Just keep working, just keep working. If you're injured and you can't do it, then, then you don't have what it takes to become an Olympic champion.
Oh,
Yeah, so my injuries were quite common because I was practicing 10-meter platform. Back injuries are very common. As you're entering the water, you really want to have a firm torso, but sometimes in an effort to make the dive, if you're going to be short, you really arch your back, and then the pressure of the water can really hurt your back in that manner.
so what happens to those athletes? I mean, are some of them crippled for life?
I do know of athletes that have injuries that are from their athletic career, and diving in particular. But the main focus of a champion is to just keep going. And the
Right.
amazing thing about the human body is it will get used to absolutely anything you do. And what I used to tell myself when I had an injury was, hey, back, I got to do this work. I'm going to either do it with you hurting or do it with you not hurting. And
Right.
eventually, the pain just goes away, and you keep practicing.
Does that catch up to you later on in life?
If anything, I believe it's benefited me.
Hmm.
I've now been retired for about 12 years, and I still have the will and the strength to work through the injuries in the same way. My daily activities are very light these days. I spent 10 years with this mentality of just work, work, work as hard as you can, repetition, repetition, and retiring from diving and finding things like meditation and silence and stillness
Hmm.
have really allowed me to focus on my internal strengths. And so when I have an injury, it's really about going inside of myself and finding that place of ease and calmness and tranquility, and then bringing that back out to the outside and really feeling my body.
That's important. Yeah, you mentioned repetition. I used to know, well, I used to run myself, and sometimes I felt like a mouse in a cage, one of those wheels, you know.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
used to brush my teeth going 1001, 1002, because running is measured these days in parts of a second, right?
Yeah.
And that really got to me, that kind of overthinking about time. Uh, did that affect you? Like you're not a time oriented. It's more like skill. But were there things that really got to you mentally, like not physically but mentally?
Absolutely. In fact, being retired from my sport now, I really recognize the mental habits and the momentum that's built up through having to go to a sport where you are honestly terrified to partake of the activities that are required for the sport.
Hmm.
So, for example, when you're learning to dive, the dives are very simple. You may just do a single dive,
Hmm.
and then you'll have to learn a flip,
Hmm.
and then you'll have to learn a flip and a dive, and then you'll have to learn two flips. And every time you add on that extra half a flip, you're doing something entirely new, and you've never done it before. And if you screw up, you're going to hurt yourself. You're going
All
to
right.
smack on the water. Also, the process of doing the dive, especially a new dive, is disorientating, right? You're throwing yourself through the air, and you basically you get dizzy and all that kind of stuff. So
Hmm.
you can imagine, as a 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old kid, you're waking up and you're thinking, oh, I got to go to diving. Oh, and especially because there's the 1 meter, the 3 meter, and the tower practices.
Hmm.
you'll take one day that's committed to each board. So maybe Monday is usually tower, and then Tuesday will be 1 meter, and then Wednesday will be tower, and
What's
then
tower? 10 meter?
tower is 10 meter. Yeah, tower is the hard platforms.
Okay.
And basically those are the most scary because they're the highest,
Yeah.
and you're often fitting in the most flips because of that extra height. And
Right.
so basically every other day you're really dreading going to practice, because it's terrifying. And if you've ever watched children being trained in diving, the coaches need to sometimes yell at the children because they will be crying at the end of the board, not wanting to go. And so this is a really interesting component of all gymnastics style, acrobatic style, elite athletics, is this culturing process of pretty much, not only is it a very submissive relationship with the coach, because the coach is telling you to do something that you don't want to do, but also the being okay in fear, and the finding content in this very stressful environment. So that was one of the major dysfunctions that I acquired mentally from the sport that I spent 10 years in. But on the benefit side, I can now approach fear head on with nearly zero disregard for the potentially the risk and potentially the negative aspects.
Right.
And that has really served me well in my adult life, because even something simple like having a conversation with a loved one that you perhaps don't want to have, that type of thing, I jump right into that and I have that conversation. Or if it comes time to change my activity because I recognize that it's unhealthy for me, I jump into that head first, because that's just what I practiced doing for so long as a 10-meter platform diver.
Right. You use the word, you submitted to the coach. The coach became the relationship between the athlete, you or the athlete, and the coach, for example, in diving. Is that a good submissiveness?
That, I suppose, depends on the coach, because as a submissive representation, as a submissive person in that relationship,
Yeah.
you are really trusting that coach.
So what happened, recently there was this terrible exposure by this particular Olympic coach in the States who had done something with over 100 girls.
Yep.
I always wondered why those girls, even, of course they were young girls, 12, 13 years old, but how that went on for so long. Is that part of this submissiveness thing?
Absolutely. And as you may or may not know, David, I myself was raped by my coach as well. And that continued on for years as well. And this is something that I have gone public with. And we've spent 5 years in court prosecuting my coach, and which was a very, very interesting experience. I hope you talk to me about that later. But to get back to your question is, if me and you, David, are spending 7 hours every day together, and I'm the guy that tells you what to do, and you just do it, and you experience for years great success from that, then you kind of just stop questioning what I'm asking you to do. And even if I do ask you to do something that harms you once, then you still have years of momentum, in your neurological pathways that says that, this guy knows what he's doing. This guy is looking after my best interest. And so even if what I'm requesting you to do harms you that one time, you still are like, well, one time people make mistakes. And then perhaps it happens again. And at that point in my personal journey, I took on the responsibility and said, man, you knew this guy had screwed up in the past. And now it's basically my fault for being tricked. And so the idea that I couldn't look after myself is, I'm sure, what a lot of these athletes experience. As well, it's really important to understand that I'm sure it's very similar for these other athletes as well. In my experience, this coach of mine was a the head coach of the national team. And everybody loved him because he was, the best coach in Canada and produced world-class athletes. And for me, when I came forward publicly and told everybody, most of the reactions were like, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Have a good day. And they would walk away. And I'm like, well, I'm telling you this so that you can protect the children you're with. And if you're not believing me, then you're allowing this guy to continue his agenda. And
It's a huge accusation to make against a public figure, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And like I say, please, if you're interested, I'd be more than happy to tell you about the process that I went through in my coming forward process, because I had to make it so public in order to get any traction in terms of removing him from his position.
Okay, we'll go back to that for sure. On a different segue, how do you handle losing? Let's say you go to a competition, and of course you're pumped up to win, and that's what you want to do. That's why you're there. But you don't. You place fourth instead of third or second or first. What is the mental process afterwards? Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. So I need to know if you would like my take on losing now or my take on losing at the time of being an athlete.
Sure, at the time.
At the time of being an athlete.
Yeah.
So I didn't do much losing as an athlete. And when I did, I recognized that it was entirely my own doing. And the important thing to acknowledge about diving is that it's not a team sport. And there's no offense or defense. There is simply doing what you can do, and you're judged on it. And so for me, whenever I lost, I recognized that I didn't do as well as I should have. And also the sport itself is so interesting because as you're spinning through the air, there's literally a split second when you decide to come out and stop your rotation can determine whether you do it perfectly or whether you do it not perfectly. And so for me, it was easy to be easy on myself because, well, I just held on a little too long. Or if it's something in particular that I was working on that particular dive, like if I had always been coming out early and landing short, then in my mind I'm thinking, hold on a little longer so that I can make it. And then perhaps when it came time to compete, I had more energy, so that holding on a little longer actually caused me to go over. And so sometimes the corrections that I was making that was detrimental in the competition were good overall corrections for me to be making. And I guess one of the biggest things about being a good athlete is your ability to make changes.
Right.
Yeah.
Those milliseconds of decision making that you mentioned are rather an amazing function of the body. Is that you're in the middle of you're falling, and you've made literally a split decision. It's really amazing. So you mentioned then as an example. How about now, reflecting back?
Absolutely. So one thing that I did forget to mention as well is my level of ignorance at the time of being an athlete, because I'm constantly taking directions. And so I didn't do a lot of thinking for myself. And now I've really gone the complete opposite way. And now I do all of my thinking for myself because I recognize and have a broader view of a belief, you could say, about what I'm doing here. And by what I'm doing here, I mean as a spirit given governance over a physical body in this environment. What am I doing here?
Right.
And
now, just sorry to stop you there, but
yeah.
Where do the parents fit into that?
Wow, great question. Awesome. So it's my belief that in an athletic environment, the parents should be there to support the athlete and the coach as well. And the more that the parents can be included in the process, the better. And in my personal experience with my sports, the coaches exiled the parents away from the athletes because of things like injuries. And when a child says to their parent, "Oh, I'm hurt," then the parent says to the coach, oh, my child's hurt, you need to not train them as hard, when really what the coach wants to do is to train them harder. And just things like distractions, and they want the coaches want the athlete thinking about their corrections and their agenda with sport related things, and they don't want them thinking about their parents and trying to impress their parents and that kind of thing. That was my experience at the club that I was at.
Okay, so for example, you get in Japan what they call monster parents, where, for example, at the baseball game where they do come to view the game, they're yelling and screaming and maybe even fighting with other parents.
Yeah.
You see that more and more these days. It's very unfortunate. But in swimming, I would assume, maybe wrongly, that the parents are not present at any practice.
They may come to practices here and there. I think a lot of the times, especially with the younger kids, the parents want the relief from time spent with their kids. It's like it's a great way it's like babysitting almost. Here, take the kids, and now I can go have my free time. But I really do believe that in a wholesome, successful athletic environment, the coaches are also coaching the parents on how to contribute in a positive way.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, oh, you're being loud and obnoxious, don't come. Instead, talking to the parents about how they can be of assistance, because ultimately we want as many positive tools to help us accomplish whatever goal we're doing, whether it's in work or school or health or sports. The more help that we can have, the better. And every human being is an opportunity to help and to contribute.
So in a way, the parents are, if they're not going to the practices, for example, like you said, there's some parents are just sloughing off there on their duty. They're just dumping their kids and saying, here's the money, here's my kid, go for it.
Absolutely.
And whereas maybe some parents, like I'm a little guilty of myself, my uncle was a gold medal winner in the Olympics in Helsinki in '52, I think it was, for field hockey.
Yeah.
And I tried to measure up to that myself when I was involved in running. Although I didn't go to the Olympics, but my youngest daughter, I have 3 daughters, and one of them, the youngest one, was quite good at athletes, and I really wanted to her to step into my shoes or my uncle's shoes, and go for it. So in a way, my point is the parents are also complicit in why the child is there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And those are important reasons that the coach should be asking, I guess. Like, why is your kid here?
Absolutely. And there is so much pressure on parents to produce successful children. And whether the coaches take advantage of that for income purposes, or simply because the coaches want to seem like they're doing a good job as well. Like I know personally in my experience that my mother was told repeatedly that I was going to go to the Olympics if I kept training as hard as I did. And in fact, if we increased training, my mom was told, your son's going to go to the Olympics. And what parent doesn't want their child to go to the Olympics?
Right.
And the important thing that I really emphasize now is that it's far more important to become an Olympian in life than it is to become an Olympian in sport.
Well, that's a very good point. And you made a point a while back that your training helped you become a better adult. And I think my training helped me become a better athlete and a better adult too. But like you say, this overtraining. Now, just to go back a bit, the coaches were saying to your mother, for example, that the more practice your son does, the better chance he or she has to go to the Olympics. In the back of your mind, is there money involved there? Are they saying that because it's true, just as far as practice? The more you practice, the better you become? Or are they saying that because they're getting more money? Are they getting funded from somebody?
Yeah, so My mother was paying, I think, $200 a month for the diving practices, which really isn't much. But where the incentive is for the coaches is the better their athletes are, then the more funding that they will get.
From the government?
Yeah, and the government usually gives the money in in the lump sum to the Canadian sport organization.
Right.
So for us, it was Diving Canada.
Right.
And if you, as a coach, if you had one national champion, you would get so much. If you had two national champions, you would get so much. And at our pool, we had so many national champions that we actually became a national training center.
Oh.
And you can imagine as a coach how nice that is to be able to say, oh, yes, I'm the head coach of the National Training Center.
Sure, yeah.
And so the incentive is maybe not so monetary, which does come along with it, but it's also the prestige and, being recognized in your field.
Right. Thank you. So, this, just going one more time to this, going back to, I don't want to get too deep into it, but just going back a bit to where a few really bad apples are abusing the children over practice or some sexual thing happening. Where are the parents there? Don't the kids go back and report this?
So in my experience, and I imagine this is quite common, is that the relationship between the coach and the athlete develops at such a young age while the athlete is developing personally, and the coach, if they are exercising a predatory agenda, they will make sure that the child grows in a way that when the act does take place, the relationships with all other supports, including parents, teachers, friends, has been entirely dissolved. And so, for example, my coach would tell me and every other athlete in our group that everybody else was an idiot, was stupid, had no idea what they were doing, and as a person that we looked up to, we believed this guy. And
you would say that other coaches or
yeah, absolutely. Other coaches have no idea what they're doing, and look at how bad all their divers were. And I was winning all the time, so I had to believe him. That my coach was the best, and that my parents were stupid, and that my parents were just going to get in the way of my career because.
Did the coaches actually say that?
Absolutely, yeah,
Really?
absolutely. Oh yeah, the culturing process is to isolate the child.
Yes.
And so that when something does happen like this, like a sexual abuse of some kind, or it's also, it happens by degrees. So in my experience, and is very common in this type of thing, the coach will talk sexually around the athletes, commenting on other people, like look at the boobs on her, or doesn't she have a great body, and would you want to have sex with her, and that kind of thing. And as an athlete, you're kind of talking with your best friend. Your coach is your best friend at that point. And so you talk openly, and so then there starts to be implemented this sexual component to the relationship. And then perhaps talking about pornography would be one of the next steps in line. And then also developing a financial relationship where, like in my experience, my coach would buy me dinners once in a while, or help fill my gas tank in the car, and he'd say, I understand you're training all the time, you don't have time for a job, I don't have a problem doing this. And so a financial dependency is built as well. And so it's not really a linear thing that takes place. It's a real ambush from all directions on the athlete by this older, well experienced, very intelligent person who basically is pretty out of control in terms of that area of their life.
Wow. Unbelievable. All right, so let's go to, this is a pet peeve of mine. Back in the day when I was an athlete, a 400-meter runner in Winnipeg, I was part of the Pan Am team there. We were definitely, there was no sponsorship.
Yeah.
And it was very black and white, absolutely none. even if I took a pair of new running shoes from my uncle, that would be considered a no-no. People were literally sleeping in their cars and poverty-stricken athletes running around. For my case, I was working, so I wasn't so badly off. But that whole system broke down around the 1980 or 81 before the LA Olympics. And now it's got to a situation where you see, for example, young women who are in their 20s and they're physically fit and very beautiful, but they're not winners. But they're up there in the top 20 or 30 maybe. They've made the grade. They're at the Olympics, but they're taken aside for a photo shoot and given $500,000. So what I'm saying is these people who are being rewarded. This is one part of sponsorship, where the sponsors with a lot of money are taking certain good-looking individuals, for example, and paying them a large sum of money just to display their body for their magazine. What's that done? What in your mind has that done, if anything, to the Olympics?
Well, my understanding of the Olympics is it is amateur athletics, and so the difference being between professionals that professionals are being paid for what they do, and amateur athletics is really supposed to be more of a passion and a hobby that propels you to such great heights, as opposed to being paid millions of dollars to do it. And I personally feel that any athlete, and pretty well anybody that's putting hard work into anything, should be compensated, or at least should reap the rewards of that. And so, yeah.
All right. So, but since the introduction of sponsorship, people showing their skis or their swimsuit. Did you wear a certain swimsuit?
Well, the interesting thing about Diving Canada is it is governed by, I'm going to say, very old school people. And when I was on the national team, Diving Canada signed a contract with Speedo, and a part of that contract was that none of the athletes could wear anything but Speedo on the podium, which is a great signing deal for Diving Canada because they get all the money. But then it also restricted all the athletes from approaching companies and saying, hey, I'm a national champion. You're going to see me, at the World Championships. I placed third at World Championships. Would you give me some money to place your logo on my jacket? And I can't do that because Diving Canada is forcing me to abide by their rules. Otherwise, I can't compete internationally because the international organization will only recognize athletes that are recognized by the governing sport of that country. And so, yeah, I really don't agree with this kind of thing, but perhaps it's a way for the athletes to remain non-professional because they're not being paid for it, but instead the governing body is being paid for it. But then you see how business is getting into a sport environment and really, I would say kind of corrupting the natural flow of a person being, paid for their value.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot to that. I remember being told in the London Olympics after the war that nobody really paid attention to the Olympics. It was just a sport, it wasn't any big deal, right? Now it's become a very big deal and a billion-dollar business. It's a business, It's like film work where you are the creator. You look at it as an art, but everybody else looks at it as a business, Going back to sponsorship, I was a little bit peeved a couple of years ago when I was here in Victoria, where we are today, and I noticed that the logo for Coca-Cola was bigger than the Olympic logo. What do you think about that?
Go figure. Well, I imagine that Coca-Cola is a huge sponsor of the Olympics.
Yeah.
And money talks. And actually, one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge is the difference between business interests and human interests. And this is a line that has become very blurred, and a lot of people don't even recognize or acknowledge the implications of it. In that the Olympics is, while it is an event what allows it to take place in such an organized fashion is the business aspect of it. And often a business will place its needs before human needs, which I know seems kind of silly because a business needs humans to run, so you would think it would look after human interests. But as I understand it, and as I've seen it happen in the world, and this is kind of a view from First Nations culture, is that everything has its own spirit. And so as a business develops, it, in some type of ethereal mental world, does have its own governing principles, which will look after itself first. And so the business of the Olympics is simply interacting with the business of Coca-Cola in the way that prospers the business of both companies the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We mentioned Coca-Cola in this video, but we're also talking about other companies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. To end that sponsorship segue, a point in case about business interfering with athletes' good will and health is the up and coming 2020 Olympics in Tokyo will be held at the end of July. Now, I just came from Japan, and I know for a fact that the Japanese government wanted the Olympics to be held early October because that's when the climate is really nice, especially for those who are performing outside. Now, the Americans sponsors, who, like you said, put in a heavy amount of money, wanted it at the end of July because that's when the American viewers are on holiday. But it's also the most hottest time in Japan, and the Olympics are being held in Tokyo, and where the venue is in the hottest place in Japan. I mean, right down Tokyo. You couldn't find a worse place to have it. The temperature when those athletes are running outside is going to be about 35 to 40 above with 100% humidity. They're going to be dropping like flies. I know for a fact that they've put the relay, the marathon, up to 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. to try and avoid the heat. So what I'm saying here again is the athletes are going to suffer at the hands of the sponsors because of the sponsors' interest in having it in their own interest.
Absolutely, yeah. And what that brings to my mind is the journey of an athlete past being an athlete and what inspires that. And if things are so good for an athlete their entire career, most likely they will do the sport until they can't do it anymore, and then they become then they become a coach in the sport.
Right.
Because the sport has taken up so much of their attention that they've neglected to source other avenues of life and other experiences.
Right.
And it's my personal belief that being an athlete should be a part of a person's life and not be the entirety of a person's life. Right. And so things like organizations taking advantage of athletes is a great incentive for athletes to recognize, man, what the heck am I doing here? You know, it's time for me to move on with my life.
Right.
And that really speaks volumes to the process of life in general, of how, you know, if we follow our heart and allow ourselves to be honest with how we feel in the moment, then that will allow us to source other opportunities. Even though usually staying doing what you're doing is the most comfortable, I don't think that we come here to simply become an expert in one area and then continue to experience that expertise environment. I think it is really important for us to grow in multiple areas to enrich our spirit and our faculties as a being.
Well said. Now, furthering that comment, these people who become, we were mentioning a while ago about the problems with coaches and sexual misconduct. These coaches, I'm not aware, I'm not too sure of their background, but these coaches, were they themselves athletes? Is this a case of the bully, you know, who was before, when he was younger, he was abused and then he becomes a bully, and is it like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, there obviously are going to be some rare occasions, but in general, and for most of the time, anybody that partakes of abusing somebody has gone through abuse themselves. It's undeniable. We are all born into this world as kind, loving, gentle, and intelligent beings, and we are also put into an environment. And some environments are very dysfunctional, and it's really difficult for somebody who hasn't experienced dysfunction to look at somebody else who is dysfunctional and recognize that people are dysfunctional because that's what they were taught. We are simply almost like a computer running programs. And the only programs that we have access to running are programs that were given to us by our experiences. And so, like, I know personally, my mother was adopted. And so as I grew up, she was very comfortable bringing us into environments that were very hostile. And that was simply because she grew up without any love at all. And so any love was a step in the right direction for her. And so being around abusive men and like very toxic environments was natural for her because she wasn't taught any different. And so it's really important to exercise a level of compassion and understanding for the abusers as well as the people who are abused, because I think the main focus for all of us when acknowledging this unfortunate experience is that we want to fix it and make it better.
Right.
It's not enough to just point the finger at the abuser and say you did a bad thing, because even the abuser knows that deep down inside. And what's most important is that we as healthy people are able to help make a positive impact in that environment. And that's only possible through compassion and understanding and acknowledging what the real problems are so that we can fix them, instead of just pointing at the effects of the problem and, shaming them.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we got about 3 minutes left, so just a couple of short questions for you. Drug use. Do you think there's drug use involved in the Olympics? In diving?
Are you talking
Today?
about performance enhancing drugs or illicit drugs?
Performance enhancing drugs.
I believe that there is performance enhancing drugs at the highest level of nearly every sport. Diving is somewhat immune to it simply because you don't really want to change your body any more than you can mentally handle it, because there's such a mental and emotional component to diving. So it doesn't make sense for me to do a bunch of steroids and become super, super bulky, because I still have to be very lean and fast to accomplish these dives. But in sports, like where they have to hit something hard or they have to be very fast or that type of thing, in my personal opinion, it is undeniable that performance enhancing drugs are there and they are encouraged. The reason why they are publicly discouraged is because it's not very healthy for us to have young kids growing up expecting to have to do drugs in order to be good at their sport. Because then if it's publicly acceptable, then it's like, at what age are we giving them drugs? And then that age has an interest in being lower and lower and lower, so that the athletes can become better and better at a younger age. So again, the business interest versus the human interest is actually well respected in regards to publicly saying we don't do performance enhancing drugs, to respect the human aspect. But business wise, nearly every top level athletics has performance enhancing drugs, because the stakes are just so high. And to be honest with you, I believe that these things can be used for their purpose in a healthy way. Athletes do all kinds of things to improve their performance, get a good night's sleep, have a good diet, train, be there when you train, show up, we do all these things, and then we're going to draw the line at using technology, which, steroids and performance enhancing drugs is a type of technology. Why are we limiting that? All of a sudden we're saying you can't do that. And I think, again, that is to protect the innocence of the sports themselves and those that partake of it.
Well, Johnson, you remember Johnson back in Korea? He was Ben Johnson.
That's right, yeah.
He was caught using certain drugs,
Yeah.
performance-enhancing drugs. So I suppose that there are. This is a question. I suppose that there are some performance-enhancing drugs that are allowed by the Olympic body.
I think it's a very individual. It goes on a very individual basis,
Hmm.
depending on the athlete themselves, how much it will affect the sport, the personal relationships involved within the sport.
Hmm.
I really do think that what causes an athlete to get busted
Hmm.
really is an individual basis, because there are so many athletes that get away with it and there are so many athletes that don't. And like John Jones, for example. John Jones in UFC is a huge superstar, and he's pretty well allowed to do the steroids. They say, well, it's a picogram. They invent this picogram. And then the story that they tell about how the test came back negative or positive for the substance and all this kind of thing. He's a huge draw. And in fact, the one city where the event was scheduled said we're not going to allow him to fight, so UFC moved it to another city, like, less than, within a month to go. And so the business interest is really big, and there's the personal relationships as well. And so these kinds of things, they happen. And again, I do want to emphasize that every experience that we view as unfair or compromising is an opportunity for the individual experiencing that to recognize that there's a better life path for them.
Yeah.
Every single time, it goes without saying. That's why we experience bad things, is so that we can recognize that we should be going in another direction.
Yeah.
That's why it hurts to put our hand in the fire, so that we recognize that you don't put your hand in the fire.